This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 18 of season 5, and today we are joined by a very special guest, horror writer Grady Hendrix.
So I don't know necessarily that Grady Hendrix needs a long introduction because he's been on this podcast twice before and we really enjoy having him. But we did want to tell you all listeners about his book that's coming out. So Grady Hendrix's upcoming book is The Final Girls Support Group. It'll be out on July 13th, 2021. I'm sure you could probably pre-order it now. For those of you who really enjoyed his last book, I'm sure you've been looking forward to this. So the Final Girl Support Group has this description. In horror movies, the final girl is the one who's left standing when the credits roll. The one who fought back, defeated the killer, and avenged her friends. The one who emerges bloodied but victorious. But after the sirens fade and the audience moves on, what happens to her? Lynette Tarkington is a real-life final girl who survived a massacre 22 years ago, and it has defined every day of her life since. And she's not alone. For more than a decade, she's been meeting with 5 other actual final girls and their therapists in a support group for those who survived the unthinkable, putting their lives back together piece by piece. That is until one of the women misses a meeting and Lynette's worst fears are realized. Someone knows about the group and is determined to take their lives apart again, piece by piece. But the thing about these final girls is that they have each other now. And no matter how bad the odds, how dark the night, how sharp the knife, they will never ever give up. So listeners, please enjoy this talk as we dive deeper into the final girl phenomenon and talk with Grady about his upcoming book.
Okay, well, we're here with Grady Hendrix. Thank you, Grady, for joining us today.
What? I'm always happy to. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, well, when I heard that you had written a book called The Final Girls Support Group, I got so excited. I know you do a whole lot of research going into your books, and it always sounds like a lot of fun. So I can only imagine the research that went into this. So do you want to, talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the book is about these final girls, and I've always sort of wondered, like, what happens to them next? Like, how do you live the rest of your life after this horrible thing happened, the worst night of your life when you're like 17? Because the thing with the final girl is not only do they have to survive, they have to kill someone. Like they have to kill the killer, which I think is like super traumatic. And so this is about a support group for them years later, and someone's killing them one by one. And it's funny, before I write a book, usually a lot of my research is like period research, a lot of research on support groups and things like that. But most of the research I did on slashers was after the book was done because I wanted to put a show together that I'm going to be doing, even though it's going to be virtual. I'll be doing a show like I sometimes do to promote the book. And so now I'm in the middle of that, and I'm reading all these like serial killer and slasher books and watching all the movies again and watching the ones I haven't watched and, putting together a unified field theory of slashers, which is fun. But the weird thing is everyone's pretty familiar with the movies. The books are a little weirder, and like the books sort of get a little more omnivorous. Like I'm including serial killer books and sort of murder books is what they're under. Because there's stuff like Black Christmas, which has no relation to the Black Christmas movie, but it's like a giallo, like a full-on giallo set in upstate New York on like Christmas Eve, and the small town sheriff. He's got to figure out who's killing people one by one, and he's super stressed out because he's getting divorced, and he hasn't even bought his daughter a Christmas present yet, and everyone's turning up dead, and the killer wears like black leather gloves and kills people with a straight razor, and you never see their identity, and they're all these red. I mean, it's super duper giallo. And then there's stuff like Steroid Blues by Richard Laplante, which is like an early 90s book about a dude who's a super jacked bodybuilder with this like beard, and he's covered in body hair, and they constantly talk about how his penis is like what do they call it? A dangling brown worm, and and he's always like getting pumped up and like taking meth and taking steroids, and then he goes out and he's murdering people, and he's murdering all these neo-Nazi bodybuilders who are also steroid dealers and meth dealers because they killed his sister. And the main one is this Austrian dude who wears like a unitard that has fake testicles built into it with like silicone that looks like he has giant balls, and so he's trying to get to that guy and kill him. And that guy like drinks fresh monkey brains. He gets them like shipped in, and then you discover at the end, twist, the jacked up bodybuilder who's killing people to avenge his sister is actually the sister, and she's taken steroids for so long that she's turned into a man. And at the end of the book, fortunately, the sympathetic karate dealing coroner who's like the cop on the case, his gifted and talented wife is an amazing plastic surgeon, and so she's able to put her body back together. So like, I mean, so that's not quite a slasher, but it's a murder book, you know? So I'm just sort of, it's hard to pass things up when you see a little jewel like that.
I'm glad I was on mute while you were discussing that, because
I feel like everyone hung up.
Oh, I was trying not to laugh into my microphone too much. Okay, well, this is something that we've kind of talked about a little bit, because the Final Girl seems to be connected like to the slasher genre, but
yeah,
it's hard to like define what the slasher genre is, because I've heard people who get like really, you know, nitpicky about like, no, that doesn't fit, or this doesn't fit. But then I like the way he kind of just described it as murder books.
Right.
Because that's kind of what the Final Girl has to live in. Like, she has to live in the murder world, and then that way she can come through the murder world. So I don't know. In doing all this research, like, did you change your definition of slasher at all, or does it matter?
Well, yeah, I don't. Okay, so A, it doesn't matter. B, though, I find like going over and over issues of like taxonomy like this really fascinating and kind of educational. Like, who cares if something's a horror novel or a thriller? Who cares if it's a slasher or a serial killer book? On the other hand, trying to figure out what makes it a slasher or serial killer book, I think makes you start thinking about what these books are about and their commonalities. So I think a slasher is a killer in a confined location, working their way methodically through the cast, and the last person left alive usually kills or otherwise disables the killer. And that to me is the slasher definition. I think Alien fits as a slasher. You know, I don't think a slasher you have to have a concealed identity. Like, everyone knows who Jason is by the second or third movie. You know, everyone knows who Freddy Krueger is. They just don't believe he exists. Everyone knows who Michael Myers is. He has the eyes of pure evil. So, like, you know, the concealed identity, I think, is more of a Giallo thing. But, like, by that definition, you know, Alien certainly fits in, which I think, and I think most people consider Sigourney Weaver a final girl, at least when you see her grouped in, you know. But, and I also think that in general, a slasher isn't supernatural. I mean, yes, Jason's a zombie. Michael Myers has a, you know, he's a druid or whatever. Freddy Krueger, people can't really kill you in your dreams. But, like, you know, it's not like a vampire. Like Jeepers Creepers, I don't think of as like a slasher, you know, or Jeepers Creepers too. So because it's a supernatural monster, although then Alien, well, I don't know, that's science fiction. So yeah, but it's murder, right? It's people killing people who are the luckiest people of all. So that's my definition of a slasher.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I completely, yeah, I don't know. It does bother me the way people feel like they have to really like pinpoint what something is or what something isn't. Anyway,
but it is fun.
It is, I mean, it is fun. It's
well,
what we like to talk about.
and it makes you kind of think about like the commonalities between the films, right?
Right. I mean, yeah, that's what movie people do, right?
I've heard. I read an article once.
I wanted to jump in just really quickly, because you were talking about how the genres blend into each other. Grady, while you were doing all this research, watching movies and reading books, Did you see commonalities between the books and the movies? Like, did the books start following trends when the slasher film became more popular, or do they
Oh yeah.
borrow from each other, or no?
No, I think they do, and I think and I'll never read enough. Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's always someone will be like, yes, you read 78 books, but you didn't read this one that changes everything. And so I speak from a point of profound ignorance, but the big thing that happened, I think, with slashers is that they got more for kids, right? As time went by. Like Black Christmas is a nasty movie. Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a nasty movie. Those, I mean, teenagers watch them, but they are not for kids. Halloween, more for kids, but nasty. Friday the 13th, getting more for kids. And then, as the 80s went on, slashers got more and more aimed at a kid audience, right? Like, the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. I mean, I think those are 100% aimed at teenagers. The later Halloweens, the later Friday the 13th. And so you see that too with the books. Like early on, there's a lot of murder books, like a lot of like the murder books are influenced by like Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon and stuff like that. And then as you go along, you start getting into much more fun books that are more YA. Like Christopher Pike has written a bunch of books that I think would be called slashers. People say R.L. Stein writes books that are like slashers, but I refuse to accept what R.L. Stein writes or books. So I don't know about that. You see stuff like Joe Gibson, who wrote my favorite slasher book of all, Sleigh Ride. No, Sleigh Bells. Sorry, Jesus, I did my favorite. I don't even know the name. Sleigh Bells, which is great. Like it is literally the closest thing you can get to like an 80s slasher in book form. So yeah, so as time goes by, they get more and more aimed for kids, and the books sort of split into two tracks, right? Post Silence of the Lambs, you've got the super gory, super gross serial killer books like Rex Miller's Slob and stuff like that. And then on the other side, you've got the more YA stuff from Christopher Pike and Joe Gibson and authors like that. There was even a Halloween series of YA books starring Michael Myers. And so you have that track.
I had honestly never really thought about it as an age, like from an audience point of view. I had never thought of slashers that way. The thing that always stuck out to me about slashers or like these kind of murder horror films is that most people, I think, who came into horror through that door.
Yeah.
And that makes complete sense now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, exactly. There's so many of them. And, they're group movies, right? Like, who wants to hang out with their friends and watch Silence of the Lambs? Like, who wants to hang out with your friends and watch Seven? Like, those are heavy movies, But, like, watching Friday the 13th Part 4, sure, why not? That's fun. That's a movie you can, like, half pay attention to a little bit,
No, absolutely. And the Christopher Pike, too. Like, you mentioned Christopher Pike, but I don't think that can be like overstated, at least for me, how important Christopher Pike was in my introduction to horror, because a lot of people talk about Stephen King when they talk about reading horror, which of course, because he's written everything, he hasn't stopped. But like for me, it was Christopher Pike and all of his Remember Me and Slumber Party, and even the one, The Midnight Club, which I just reread recently, which isn't a murder book, but it reads like one in a weird way, because like death is almost like stalking this group of kids, even though it's in the form of like illnesses. But yeah, I don't know.
Did you read R.L. Stein much, or just mostly Christopher Pike?
I read a few R.L. Stein. I could not tell you what I read. I read some of his Fear Street books. Those were the first ones I picked up, because I grew up in like a really conservative household where like things were monitored as far as what I watched. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, I could read whatever I wanted.
Same here.
Yeah. I went crazy when I got to the Walden books, because they had that whole like YA section, and I started with Fear Street and then very quickly moved on to Christopher Pike, but I could not tell you which Fear Street books I read.
So. Yeah, no, it's same here. I mean, I wasn't allowed to watch R-rated movies, but as long as it had pages that turned, it was considered okay. But that led to this weird thing where I would convince my scoutmaster when we went to the gas station for snacks after, I think it was my Cub Scoutmaster maybe, for snacks after meetings, that my parents said it was okay for me to buy magazines with my snack money. And so I'd buy Fangoria and then like sneak it home. And then I would read it and then pretend I'd seen the movies, because like they pretty much gave you the whole plot. So like, that's how I quote unquote saw like most of the horror movies before I was like 15.
Oh, same. Fangoria and Blockbuster was useful for that because, they showed a lot on the VHS covers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I snuck a lot of plots that way. Like I told a lot of people I had seen Hellraiser when I had absolutely not.
Yeah. For me, it was Alien because I read the comic book adaptation of Alien years before I saw it. And so I was like, oh, yeah, this movie's great. And like, I was the first one to quote unquote see it in my carpool.
I love it. All right. Well, I guess like if the 80s and 90s, or since we're kind of talking about that era and the slashers and the final girls, I'm wondering, who do you think is the most influential final girl of that time period?
I mean, the most influential, it was got to be Laurie Strode,
Yeah.
I think she really set the template for a lot. Like Adrienne King is great, but Adrienne King's in one movie. You know what I mean? And a little bit of the second one, like from Friday. Like Laurie Strode, she's in, and I feel like one thing that's really important with final girls and these things and slashers is there's more than one. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, not always, but like the Prowler, there's only one, thank God. But like with like Final Girls, the sequel seems to be really important, which I always thought was kind of like cruel. Like you survive all this stuff, all this terrible things happen to you, you watch all your friends die, you have to murder someone, and then it happens again. And like sometimes you get like bumped off at the beginning of it, like at the beginning of Friday 2, when Adrienne King gets killed in the beginning, you're like, that is horrible. Like, and Halloween H2O, I think is like such a great ending for that franchise. Like it's so good, and Jamie Lee Curtis is so on board. And then they're like, and they promised her they wouldn't make another one. And they're, Mustafa Akkad's like, oh, we made a lot of money. Screw you. We're making another one. And so, everything that happens at the end of H2O, which I think is a great moment between Laurie Strode and Michael Myers. Oops, it wasn't really Michael Myers. You actually like just tortured to death this poor paramedic, you asshole. Like it's just so cruel and mean. And I feel like, okay, and this is where I'm going to get super pretentious, but like the franchises laid the groundwork for where we are now with movies. Like, there's not a lot of difference between a Nightmare on Elm Street movie and a Marvel movie. Like, it's recurring characters, they've got superpowers, there are quips, everything's serious but not too serious. And you've got the like superpowered dude who keeps appearing. Like that kind of repeated franchise that really paved the way for sort of this franchise world we live in now. I mean, the slashers got huge, in the 80s when everyone realized that the blockbuster sequels made a lot of money, And there's even been people who are so cold-hearted, I don't think I'm one of them, who suggest that sort of the rise of serial killers, which isn't really a rise in serial killers. It's just a rise since the late 70s of using that term and labeling people committing crimes like that serial killers and investigating them as serial crimes and a special kind of crime. That really fits in with sort of the serial nature of entertainment. And that's one reason that people are sort of obsessed with serial killers in a pop culture kind of way, because they keep doing it. It's a character who does it over and over again. You get to know them, and it's like, I mean, it's a little cold hearted, but I kind of can see if you squint and look at it sideways, they got a point.
I think it's an interesting, like when you say the repetition of it can be cruel toward the final girl character, that there's a cruelty there. I found myself wondering if there's almost a gendered aspect to that, like just running this, because we call them final girls, like Gone Girl or Girl on the Train, that kind of preponderance of the use of the term girl. Do you think that I totally understand what you're saying about making more money with the sequels, and the idea of the serial killer makes total sense. But I wonder if there's something about, like, I don't know, this is probably too strong of a word, but like torturing the final girl character, that she's not going to make it at some point, or the audience is waiting for her to not make it, if that makes sense. Do you feel like that might be part of that character idea?
Well, there is, I don't know, there is an aspect where it's like she survived one of them, let's put her in another one and another one and another one until eventually the actress moves on. Like now she's dead. Like, like how much can you take? There is that, I mean, there have been final boys before, far fewer. I mean, I'm thinking, what's his name? Mark Gatiss from Nightmare on Elm Street 2. But yeah, I mean, I don't think though that there's a delight in torturing the final girl. One thing I don't really super agree with Carol Clover, and I hate to blaspheme on a podcast, but she talks a lot about the killer's point of view and putting yourself in the killer's point of view. And I get it. And I think she's making a good point. But also that comes out of the books. Like, putting someone in the shoes of the killer is a literary device that goes all the way back to fiction in the 20s and the 30s. And, someone like David Wardwell writes really cleverly about how that got picked up and turned into a narrative device in movies in the 40s. And you see that again, and it gets sharpened and honed into, like, you see books where they sort of like Psycho, where every other chapter, I think, is from Norman Bates' point of view, or books like Dorothy Hughes in A Lonely Place, or Jim Thompson's The Killer Inside Me, where the whole book is narrated from the killer's point of view, the serial killer's point of view. And then you start getting into movies that sort of like, they show things from the killer's point of view. And I think that's a holdover, a little bit from that literary device, sort of getting Xeroxed and Xeroxed and Xeroxed until it's blurry and doesn't look like the original anymore. But back to your point, sorry, that was a really long-winded digression. I don't think the intention's to torture the serial girl. I really don't. I think maybe it is, I don't know. But what you see on screen is someone who gets everything thrown at them, and by all rights should give up. And you see many other characters give up, and she doesn't. And she keeps going, and she can't be stopped. And to me, that's like, that is a little more triumphant than sort of it's a gender torturing of her. Now, whether that reads as sexist or misogynist or not, I don't know, but I don't read it that way, but I can see how you could.
Yeah, I mean, I always look at the final girl as being, the reason she's recurring is because she is so triumphant.
Right.
And she's the survivor. Because one of the problems, I think, and I mean, I don't know if it's a problem, but one of the things I see happening with especially the slasher films that get, made over and over and over again, where you are just kind of seeing the same formula because it sells and it makes money, is at some point people start rooting for the killer to like mow down the victims, because
right.
that's what you're there to see. And it loses some of the terror, because in the earlier, when you're first seeing something that's new and you see it from the killer's point of view, it's terrifying. Like those scenes in Black Christmas in the first one, when the killer's outside the house, it is absolutely scary. It is one of the scariest home invasions, those scenes where, because you're seeing him trespass somewhere where he's not welcome, where he's not wanted, and only bad things are going to happen. So it intensifies that fear, seeing it from his point of view. But then I think, by the time you're watching Friday the 13th part, whatever, you do just start to want to, you're like, oh, okay, here are more people. They're about to get killed. Let's see this happen. And you kind of cheer, because it's that communal thing of watching with your friends, right?
Yeah.
But the final girl always seems exempt from that, because at that point we can pick her out and be like, oh, she's the one who's going to survive, so I'm going to root for her, and everybody else can just bite it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about it though. It's like a sporting event, right? It's like Rumble in the Jungle. you're watching Ali and Foreman. That's who you're there for. You want to see Michael Myers and Laurie Strode mix it up. You're there for the main event. Everyone else is a chump, and you don't want to root for a chump who's going to go out. You want to root for the champs, the final girl and the killer.
Is looking at it in this way part of your inspiration for the upcoming book? Because the idea of the final girl support group, that what happens afterward, after all that trauma.
Yeah, and actually, can I jump back to something you were saying a minute ago, Mel? Because I actually think when you were talking about
Sure.
all this stuff getting thrown at the final girl, the question is, well, who's throwing it at her, right? Because these movies aren't documentaries, so it's like a director and a screenwriter and a producer, right? They're the ones throwing all this stuff at the final girl and making her life hell, and yet she survives. She wins. She becomes like the famous one. You know what I mean? Like the John Carpenter can do all he wants to Laurie Strode. Laurie Strode's more famous than John Carpenter. Like Jamie Lee Curtis. Stephen Miner can do everything he wants to Adrienne King and kill her off in Friday Part 2. Adrienne King's doing conventions and having a fine life. Thank you very much. So, I mean, if that's the case, it's almost even more triumphant if you look at it as like a behind the scenes thing, that these women are getting tormented in these movies, and then like, yeah, okay, and you can go cash your check, and she's going to go off and be famous.
No, I like that way of looking at it. She's the ultimate survivor and almost becomes like folkloric, like a folkloric hero of some sort. Excuse my dog just started barking, but
no. And it's funny, like even in Halloween 8, what's the one with the reality show? Is that 8? The one after H2O, or no, 2 after H2O. I can't remember. Whichever one it is, with Busta Rhymes, when he kung fu kicks Michael Myers out the house and like actually kills Michael Myers. If you've ever seen that with the crowd, everyone's cheering for Busta Rhymes. Like it is kind of like, people root for Michael Myers when it's someone who doesn't have a chance of beating Michael Myers. But as soon as the shoe's on the other foot, they're all rooting for whoever's going to kick Michael Myers' butt. But anyways. So
I think, is that Halloween Resurrection?
Yes, Halloween Resurrection. But what number is that? Is that 9?
Maybe.
I like to call the Halloween movies by their number, just to remind people of how ridiculous it is that there are this many of them.
Yeah, I could not tell you which one that was.
Yeah, because H2O is 8, right?
So then it must be 9, because it came out 9. After that one.
Yeah.
No.
Sigh. Sorry, Mel, and you were saying something a second ago about the book, and I have to promote the book. I'm here. Just like all these people learn in these franchises, the ultimate unstoppable killer is market capitalism, right? Those movies are just Michael Myers is going to keep coming back as long as he makes money. So we're all at the mercy of the forces of the market. So what were you saying? I just totally spaced.
Oh, no, that's fine. I was just wondering if this question that you had mentioned, like the final girl keeps returning and she's kind of traumatized, but she has to come back and go through it again. Was that part of what inspired you to look at a final girl support group?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's so mean. Like, if someone like invades your house and ties you up and tortures you and kills your family, that's horrible. I mean, that is really horrible. Good luck coming back from that. You're going to spend the rest of your life dealing with that. 3 years later, they do it again. That's the fate of a final girl. It's like, good God. Like after something terrible happens to you, people are going to say, look, this is really bad, but you're safe now and it's going to be okay. And it's going to be one day at a time. Not if you're a final girl. You're never safe if you're a final girl. What if there's a third sequel? It's just, you're never safe. You can never let your guard down. And so I wanted to sort of write about like, what are the responses to that? You can, get high all the time and ignore it. You can be in denial about it. You can, face it and turn into like a jacked up survivalist, paranoid nutbag. You can like totally like go the Oprah way and be like, I will take this trauma and make it into something good to help others. I mean, there are all these ways. And it was just sort of like the gift that kept on giving the harder I shook that slasher tree.
I feel like that's something that doesn't get explored enough. I mean, obviously in the franchised slashers, it's just Laurie Strode just keeps coming. She's like, okay, he's back again. Let's get him again. But the one thing when you talk about kind of like trauma and the final girl, I always think about Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the end of that film. And the first time I saw it, like I was absolutely, my senses were kind of obliterated after I saw that movie, because that was the first one I had seen that was like a real proper, murder movie. And the scene at the end, first, Leatherface like doing his like ballet twirl with the chainsaw, and you kind of, you have to process that, but then seeing her get away on the truck, but absolutely covered in blood, and just thinking, she's not okay. And that was like the first film that I saw where it kind of hits you exactly what that means, because I think I had seen a good number of Halloween and like Friday the 13th before I saw Texas Chainsaw. So I feel like that's a really heavy subject to explore.
Yeah, well, and everyone remembers their first time seeing Texas Chainsaw. That movie is a movie I hated for years. And then finally I realized I hated it because it worked. Like it's so, there's really nothing else like it. So one of the things is I tried really hard not to talk about trauma in the book or to talk around it, and not to talk about this being like a serious examination of trauma, because I feel like so many people cope with real trauma in their lives, and I'm talking about made up people. But I do feel like there's a sense, a lot of people have, I think a lot of people, that you're constantly struggling with something, and whatever it is, and it's gaining on you, and your life is this chase sometimes where you're just barely escaping with your life, and it's just this struggle that's going to be with you forever. And I kind of wanted to write a book about, like, sort of where that goes. Like, can that get anywhere good? Because really, sort of two things prompted this book. And one was realizing that I'd spent so much of my life watching horror movies and watching people get murdered for fun. And I was like, what the hell? What's wrong with me? Should I be put away from other people? And then realizing so many people did it. And like, well, what does this mean? Because I do think that constant exposure to some things can desensitize you to it. I mean, Facebook's a case in point. But I also came to sort of realize that, for me at least, and maybe not for everyone, I mean, everyone does it for different reasons, there is, when I watch these movies, I'm rooting for the survivor. I'm trying to figure out who's going to live. And for me, their escape is sort of my vicarious triumph. Like, and so for me, I was like, oh, there is more than just murder to these movies, although the murder's fun. I always like to see the kills and all that stuff. But ultimately, what really distinguishes a slasher or a horror movie I like versus one that I'm okay with is that ending. Where does that ending go? And it doesn't have to be a happy ending, but there has to be some kind of triumph or something. I mean, I don't want to spoil a movie that's almost 40 years old, but like one of my favorite movies of all time, not just horror movies, is Return of the Living Dead. That doesn't necessarily have a happy ending, but the people in it fight and they struggle and they win those struggles. And for me, that's super important. They may not all win them intact, and they may, have horrible things happen later, but I don't like seeing people get treated like someone pulling the wings off a fly. I don't like seeing them tortured, even though I like the first Hostel movie quite a bit. I don't like seeing them tortured gratuitously. I want there to be a point. But the other thing that inspired this book is, first off, was the beginning of Friday the 13th Part 2, and just how horrible that is for Alice Hardy. She survived one, and she's putting her life back together, and you're like, oh, you got to live in this depressing house, and your mom's yelling at you on the phone, and that bathrobe's so gunky, and like, but good for you. You're like, you're really doing it day by day, and all of a sudden, ice pick in the head, and you're like, holy shit, that is really cold blooded, like, for real. And then the other one that really blew my mind is seeing Nightmare on Elm Street 3, where Heather Langenkamp from the first movie shows up as a group encounter therapist for the kids in the third movie. And I'm like, holy cow. Like, Final Girls helping Final Girls. That's amazing. Like that's a great career choice. So like maybe Marilyn Burns at the end of Texas Chainsaw went on to become like a trauma counselor.
I feel like that's what happened in one of the Scream movies. Didn't
Oh, did Sydney become a therapist?
I feel like she did. Maybe she did. I might be making that up. Maybe in like the third movie.
Well, definitely in oh God, what was the movie? He knows you're alone. Yeah, He Knows You're Alone, about the guy calling the babysitter.
Wait, the one in the 70s?
Yeah, the one in the 70s.
Oh, was that the one? Wait, was that the one where he was calling from inside the house?
Yes.
Okay. No, what was the name of that?
It's not He Knows You're Alone, I feel like, is about a woman on, like, she marries some dude who's like psycho or something. Hold on.
Wait, When a Stranger Calls is the one I'm thinking
When a Stranger Calls. Yes.
Yeah.
So When a Stranger Calls, which is for 1970, Carol Kane plays the girl who gets torn, the babysitter in that.
Yeah.
And When a Stranger Calls Back, which is an amazing sequel, I think from the early 90s, Carol Kane plays a trauma counselor who's like brought specifically in to help out the girl it's happening to again. I mean, it's so great. Also, Charles Durning is in it, and it's like fat Charles Durning, and he's like, they make him as like physical threat to the killer, but they can never show him walking because I guess he gets super out of breath. It's really amazing. He just sort of teleports around. But When a Stranger Calls Back is really good.
Oh, I actually have not seen the sequel to that, but I love When a Stranger Calls. So now I'm gonna have to go look this up because
it's weird. It's definitely weird, but it's worth it.
Oh man, and it looks like, I mean, I just did a quick Google, but it was in 1990. Oh, made for television. Yeah, I've got to watch this.
Oh yeah, it's really it's like the first movie. It's got this super tense opening half hour, and then it just, unlike the first movie, which gets, I think, a little pedestrian after the opening. It's still good, but like, it's a thriller.
Yeah.
This turns into this super weird early 90s psychodrama. Like, all I'll say is this: the killer has a ventriloquist act with a dummy.
Of course he does.
And it's an existential ventriloquist act.
Okay, you sold me.
That movie sells itself.
Yeah, I am 110% going to find this. I've been, this is me getting just really annoying with films, but like with everything being so weird in the past like year and being stuck at home, one of the projects I've become like obsessed with is collecting more like physical media.
Yeah.
Because I guess it's like a weird comfort thing. But I was telling somebody, I was like, I really want to find all of these, like the really random, like made for TV movies, like horror movies and all that. But I want to get them specifically on VHS.
Oh, sure.
And just so I have them for that experience. Like, this is just, I don't know.
Well, I mean, what you're going to have to do is start haunting garage sales, so yard sales, right? Like,
yeah.
Like, it's so, because that's even better if they come with like the ads still on the tape from where someone taped it off TV.
Oh, absolutely. I wish I still had half of mine. My sister and I had one of those VHS tapes that was like specifically for taping on the TV. And we figured out that for a while we could just tape whatever we wanted because, again, our parents weren't watching. So we did that for a while. I have no idea where those are. They're probably in a landfill somewhere.
Do you actually have a working VCR?
I don't. No, I'm going to have to get one of those too. Like I said, what?
I keep thinking someone is missing an opportunity, because if there was a streaming platform that was all made for TV movies and like they showed original ads like in the ad breaks, I would subscribe to that so hard.
Oh, 100% I would. Absolutely. And they would have to be, they would just have to be solely made for TV movies. Nothing that had a wide theatrical release.
Never, ever, ever. Made for TV movies only. Or you could sometimes, if they did a mainstream feature film, as long as it had a television cut that was radically different from the theatrical version, I would accept it.
That was the other thing I think like my children will never understand is if you saw a movie in the theater that you loved and then you were waiting for it to come out on the television so you could tape it and have it like have your favorite movie and own it, and then you realize that your favorite parts were cut out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that always confused me because I'd be like, wait, is this the same movie? Does that part exist? Like I was very weirded out. My thing I did was I would tape record, our VCR was really crappy, so I would like audio tape movies I really loved and listen to them over and over again, which sounds like something a caveman would do.
I may have done that a few times.
Oh my God. I listened to my tape of The Road Warrior so many times. I used to be able to do the complete opening 20 minutes of that movie, including the sound effects. Like, they weren't good sound effects, but I knew exactly where they came. I wish I could still do that.
Oh, mine was Pee Wee Herman, so.
Oh.
I still consider Pee Wee's movie my first horror movie because that was the first movie that like scared the piss out of me.
Yeah, Large Marge.
Large Marge, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a moment. You know, for my generation, which is a couple before yours, the moment is the end of Darby O'Gill and the Lost Little People, which is the Leprechaun movie Disney made starring Sean Connery, where all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a freaking banshee shows up at the very last bit and like drags this person's soul off to hell. And it's like, whoa, and it is this crazy optical effect. And like parents would show it at birthday parties. I saw it at Peter Mansfield's birthday party, and one of the kids there actually did pee their pants. We were 5, and this thing. And so I feel like Large Marge is very similar. Like, oh, it's a fun movie for kids. No, it's not.
Up until that point, it was amazing.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think they're actually, I don't know if it's still around, but there used to be a YouTube channel where a guy had taped all of the Saturday morning cartoons from like the late 80s and into the 90s for like the 4 or 5 hour blocks and uploaded it to YouTube. Like he had taped it back in the day, commercials and all. Not quite the made for TV thing, but
in the same ballpark. Yeah.
Same ballpark. I watched one of them and the nostalgia hit very, very hard. So.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah.
Well, I did actually kind of have a question for you with your book, with the Final Girls myself. I was kind of thinking of, I mean, we've been talking about Final Girls and Laurie Strode and Texas Chainsaw Massacre as these big influences just in general. Did you find yourself drawing from any other sources for your Final Girl characters? Were there like any other particular Final Girls that sort of you may have realized you were writing into your book?
Well, yeah, and you know, it's they're sort of the iconic ones, you know, and I wanted to keep them a little off brand, but like, so yeah, there's a summer camp slasher, you know, there is a dream slasher, there is a Santa Claus slasher, there's a redneck inbred hillbilly cannibal slasher, there's a meta slasher like Scream, there's a brother sister slasher thing. So I wanted to have sort of each of the iconic ones, but there is a wild card final girl in this, and she sort of pops up she drops into the middle of the book. She's not in the beginning, but I realize that like those Canadian tax shelter movies, of which Black Christmas is one, and Prom Night, and My Bloody Valentine, you got to pay a little homage to those. So there is a Canadian final girl who kind of pops up in the middle. And I sort of then did a really cruel thing to her, because then I sort of dropped in that 90s direct-to-video slasher thing when it was like the Ginger Dead Man and Jack Frost and Leprechaun, you know, where they would just have a terrible special effects slasher. So I sort of, it's called Gnome Coming, because it's a gnome that kills on homecoming. So yeah. So, but yeah, I wanted to keep them sort of the big iconic ones, because I think even if you haven't seen the movies, Summer Camp Slasher, the brother sister slasher, the Santa Claus slasher, the dream, everyone knows those tropes.
Yeah, definitely. So gotta ask, We've talked about who you think is the most influential. Who's your favorite final girl? I'm curious on that.
Oh, well, gosh, I'm going to say something really lame, but like kind of all of them. Like, I really like, listen, Marilyn Burns driving away in that pickup truck is such an iconic image. I mean, one of my favorite things, I can't remember who did it. It might have been Patton Oswalt who tweeted out the GIF of that at the end of 20 on New Year's Eve, 2020, going into 2021. And I was like, yes, that is America right now. We are all Marilyn Burns in the back of that truck. But like, I mean, Jamie Lee Curtis is so iconic, and but Sydney Prescott's a big deal for me, But I will say, there's two final girls who never get the credit I think they're due, and one is Danielle Harris from Halloween 4 and 5. Even though she's much more annoying in Halloween 5, I think does an amazing job. And also Lisa Wilcox, who's in Nightmare on Elm Street 4 and 5, who gets the greatest gearing up scene, I think, almost of anyone except Rocky Balboa in a movie, or maybe Ellen Ripley at the end of Aliens. Like that and Alice Johnson gearing up in Nightmare 4. And Nightmare 4, just like Halloween 4, is super underrated. Like, dude, someone fights Freddy in a dojo, like a dream dojo with karate, and they win. It's amazing. So, yeah. So I would say in terms of like neglected final girls, I got to give it up for Danielle Harris and Lisa Wilcox. Oh, and I'll also say, I think for everyone on Earth, maybe that's exaggerating slightly, but Caroline Williams' Stretch in Texas Chainsaw 2 is like, she's like the big sister you wanted. Like, she's the big sister final girl. It's, I don't know. I don't know anyone who's seen how Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 who's not a Stretch fan.
My mind is still running on this idea of a made-for-TV movie streaming channel. Like I'm a little bit obsessed at the moment.
I don't think it would be hard.
I feel like, I mean, come on, it really cannot be that hard. But
I mean, listen, the licensing deals would be so easy. None of these networks are licensing or streaming their made-for-TV stuff. Like maybe one or two here and there.
If you could, yeah, it would really just be a matter of finding the ones that are just floating around on VHS that, nobody, I don't know anybody who owns a VHS player.
But don't you also want to do things like Mini Series Monday when it's like Herman Wouk's Wind of War, all 18 hours, just marathon,
Yes.
Or America, which was a 16-hour mini series about the Soviet Union taking over America and like machine gunning Congress. 16 hours. It's insane. I mean, I want this stuff so bad.
We used to do that. I mean, like I'm speaking like I made the movies, but miniseries were like that though.
Oh yeah.
Like when I was little,
so long.
Yeah, you'd watch them for like 2 weeks. And it's insane to think about just the fact that somebody had to like write that and film that. I mean,
well, they sort of move with soap opera pacing, right? Like,
yeah.
Like every scene barely moves to another scene. Okay, so I just looked it up. Miniseries sorted by longest, which, War and Remembrance, Herman Wouk's War and Remembrance, 30 hours. Holy cow, 30 hours. Good God. Insane.
I'm wondering if, because we have record stores now, if we'll have a store someday, Lisa, where you can go buy some VHS tapes at a VCR. Go back to that media.
Honestly, nothing would make me happier. Nothing would make me happier.
Oh my God.
Okay, we're going to be switching from this because I could be talking about this forever, but
I know.
That's not what we're here to talk about. So
wait, you mentioned you saw 13 Women.
Yes. Okay.
So first off, just for your listeners, 13 Women is this sort of weird pre-code 1932 movie that's kind of, I think, a proto-slasher. Like, I don't think it had an influence on it because no one remembers it, but it is crazy to watch it with a slasher point of view. Lisa, you saw it. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's 100% a proto slasher. Number one, it makes me not realize, but remember how much I love these kind of pre-code movies.
I know.
Like you could just tell that they were doing, I don't know, there was this, I was thinking this while I was watching the movie, is that they have this feel of they were just trying, they were experimenting with each film. It was like,
Yeah.
they had this, I mean, it wasn't exactly, movies weren't exactly new, but they kind of were, this like new medium. And it was like, oh, what can we do with this? Which is amazing. And there was okay, just to kind of back up a little bit, the conversation with 13 Women kind of started because we had been talking about what might be the first proto slasher. And I think Mel had come up with the idea of the spiral staircase, which was in 46, which fits. I mean, because you've got, the serial killings of the women, and you get a bit of the point of view of the killer, and a woman having to kill the kill the killer to kind of escape. So that fits. I like the spiral staircase, but this movie, first of all, I am obsessed with Myrna Loy in this film. I want to learn how to stare the way she stares. I don't know, I'd never seen anything like it. But for our listeners who have not seen it, basically there is 12 women who, what are they? They're connected through like an all-girls school.
Yeah, 12 women, yeah.
Yeah, 12 women because there's a third.
They were all in the same sorority.
Right. And they all go to see, what is he described as in the movie? A swami, right?
Yeah, Swami Yogadachi.
Right. And he gives them their horoscopes, which, again, coming from a conservative background, I knew right away. I was like, oh no, you're not supposed to be messing with horoscopes. This is going to be your downfall, which it was. But yes, their horoscopes were amazing. And they all basically said, this is the way you're going to die.
Oh my God, they're so good. They're like, I love Swami Yogadachi's notes to the women. It's like, you will drive nails into your own eyes before June in a screaming orgy of bloodshed. I wish it was otherwise, but the relation of Virgo to your sun sign is irrefutable. With deepest apologies, Swami Yoga. He's so apologetic, but he's so graphic and insane.
He is. And I loved the way this movie built tension too, because the women would read their prediction, and it would be like, this is going to happen before July 1st or whatever. Then the next shot would be a calendar, pages being ripped away, and you're like, oh, okay, here it is, we're about to see it. So that was really neat. I loved how you kind of had a little bit of the hysterical woman trope. I can't remember her name now. It was one of the women who had learned she was going to die horribly and was flipping out about it. And then at the same time, she learned that the Swami had said he was going to die.
Yeah.
And her friend was trying to be like the rational person, to talking her down. There is no way that this guy is going to kill himself to prove a point, basically. And she's like, yes, but if he does kill himself, then I'll know it's all true. And of course he does die. And that sends everything into tailspin. But I loved the way, I don't know, the different way the women reacted to the news of their impending, horrible, gory death. I don't know. I just found that really enjoying. And then, of course, the thing we're not talking about is that the 13th woman is really behind it all, that she's using the Swami's, I guess, his name to convince these women of how they're going to die.
Yeah, that was hard to figure out.
Oh, yeah. Were they trying to, was it power of suggestion?
I don't know. It was just she was just using him as a rube. I'm not exactly sure.
I got the impression she was supposed to have some sort of supernatural power because she was not fully white, because that's why they treat her so horribly.
Yeah, I guess she was supposed to have like some sort of that was the stare, right? Was she could like hypnotize the Swami and I forgot about that. She did put him to sleep at one point. By staring at him.
What he could do was put people to sleep, but it worked. He fell in front of the train, so
this is true. But I love that this to me fits, if we're calling like Final Girls slashers like murder, if we're looping it under the umbrella of murder movie, I think this fits as like one of the first real kind of serial killer murder movies, and I love that a woman is the villain behind it.
And I also, so two things that I think are really kind of amazing in this one is so the woman who kills her husband with the knife, right? In it, she goes crazy because that's Peg Entwistle. This is her one. Peg Entwistle is famously the actress who jumped off the Hollywood sign and killed herself. And
I did not make that connection.
And she killed herself 1 month before this movie came out. She killed herself in September, and this movie came out in mid-October, 1932. So, like, it's the one role she had in her life. And a lot of people feel like she killed herself because her career was unsuccessful. So, shout out to Peg. The other thing is, and I don't want to spoil anything because this movie's available on Amazon Prime and it's like 70 minutes long. But I love that the killer draws a big X through each woman's face, or like after they die. Like I'm a big fan of like keeping score like that. But also, there's a lot of super dubious racial stuff in this movie. But ultimately, I actually think it winds up falling on the right side of that fence. Because the reason Myrna Loy, or the reason Ursula Georgi, who's played by a white actor and sort of like weird Asian yellow face, is killing people is because of racism, because everyone found out that she was half Asian or half South Asian and was horrible to her and awful to her. And she's like, screw you, whitey. So there's this kind of like, for all the dubious racial baggage this movie has, it actually has kind of an interesting read on it.
Yeah, and she, in her bad person speech, I won't give spoilers, but you got to have one. She explains that in really specific detail. They don't shy away from that it was racism that she's responding to.
Yeah, and that because she's half South Asian, that everyone felt like she wasn't human. And like, it's really, I think it's really great. It's funny. One of the reasons I probably go on about that too much is one of the things I've noticed in a lot of serial killer fiction, less the movies, more the books, but in a lot of slashers too. There's not a lot of representation of like non-white people, but B, oh my God, they are so transphobic, like in such a crazy way. And like, it's like baked into the genre. And so whenever I see someone giving even the slightest nod to some kind of like, institutional racism and its sins, or any kind of institutional oppression and its sins, I'm like, yes, thank God.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. And that was one thing we won't go into it too much. I think that we've talked about in the past about Carol Clover's book. It's just sometimes it feels a bit prescriptive maybe with gender, because she does talk a little bit about how in these kind of slasher films, the killer is a killer because he's not like 100% fits the role of masculine. And the final girl kind of stands out from her peers because she's not like the other girls. Like she's not entirely feminine, she's the one who notices things and she's smart. And there, again, I don't want to say anything. I don't want to make it sound like we don't like Clover's book, because we do. And it was very important in kind of like kicking off this film theory, especially with the slasher genre. But I think that's one thing that sometimes if you have a pitfall with these films, that tends to be where it is. And I'd love to see that at least if 13 Women is the start, if we're going to kind of pinpoint that, then it was already pushing back on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because it's also Clover's book is what, 92, 93, somewhere in there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the early, maybe mid-90s, but yeah.
Yeah, that was the understanding of gender at the time. You had academics certainly talking about gender in much more interesting ways, and they had been for a while. But in terms of mainstream discourse, that was the conversation about gender, male, female, or you existed in some kind of liminal space in between that made you very suspect.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's kind of what she was talking about with that's what she builds her final girl theory on. And that's why, like, the final girl, is presented as kind of virginal, because she almost fits this like asexual. She's got, brunette hair. She's got a
boy's name.
Yeah. Lori, Ripley. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, well, and it's one of those interesting things that I keep trying to, and that's one of the things I'm trying to do is like, where'd that come from? Like, the furthest back I can pinpoint it is Psycho, but I know there's got to be something earlier than that, like where that notion of these killers being somehow neither male nor female, and that was part of their problem. Where did that come? And Psycho really does like put that front and center, and it was a huge hit. So it's hard to argue that might have been it, but I just keep trying to find something earlier because it's so all pervasive throughout this genre.
Well, Clover names Psycho as her kind of prototype for that.
Yeah,
I think you could look earlier, though.
Well, that's what I've been trying to do. And at the same time, it's like, there's so many of these books out there. You know what I mean? Like, Jim Thompson, certainly before Psycho, was writing killer narrated books in like 52 and with The Killer Inside Me. But he's only got one man who wears women's clothing as a killer in one of his books, who like castrates himself at the same time on like a broken window. But that's not a book about a serial killer, So I just keep, I don't know, there's this thing's got to pop up somewhere earlier. So I'm digging.
Well, okay. Mel and Matt know that I always bring up this movie, so I'm going to bring it up again because I want it to fit in somewhere. It's not I don't think, kind of the masculine, feminine, like gray area in the same sort of way, but I think it fits with the killer not being a kind of quote unquote fully functioning man. And that's House of Wax with Vincent Price.
Sure. Yeah.
Just because, being like wheelchair bound, and the whole idea of the artist who lost his ability to work because his hands are, I don't know, I think like that sort of fits. But yeah. I don't know.
But also, though, I think that idea of the killer somehow being impotent, like, isn't it Bucket of Blood with Dick Smith, where like he can't sculpt, he can't do his art, and then like he starts to kill people and like sculpt their corpses and like becomes popular. So it's like, he's got this sort of symbolic impotence, like he can't do his art, and then he has to kill people to get it back. You even look at like 13 Women. The killer is a woman and a man, and she's sort of controlling the dude. The killers always seem to exist in this weird space, but I definitely think the idea of the killer being impotent somehow, and the killings become back, that goes back a long ways.
Yeah, absolutely. The kind of, you can't fit in with the rest. Now, Bucket of Blood, that's the one where he has like his sculpture with the cat.
Yeah.
Okay. It's been a minute. Okay.
Yeah. And, you also get back to, there's this interesting thing with, like In a Lonely Place by Dorothy Hughes, not the movie with Humphrey Bogart, which is fine, but it has nothing to do with the book. But, you have this thing too, where he's a war veteran, and there's another serial killer book around the same time. Oh God, I'm losing the title, but where the guy's a war veteran, and you're like, oh, this is really interesting, actually. This idea of like, it's sort of like, what's the Hemingway book? For Whom the Bell Tolls. Is it For Whom the Bell Tolls? Where it's sort of like understood that the hero's like impotent because he got his like nut shot off in the war. But there is that kind of element to some of these books where you think that maybe there was some kind of unmanning injury in the war haunting them, making them kill people, women mostly.
The idea of impotence seems to come up again, and then the idea of the bad mother constantly. The bad mother who turns her son into a killer. It's always
freaking
something.
Moms. But but that was really in the child rearing stuff of the day. I mean, that whole idea of suffocating mothers who were turning out a generation of sissies in the like 40s and 50s. That was a big like weird bugbear people had.
Yeah, and it crossed over into kind of real life, like people who were studying serial killers later when serial killer actually became like a term. That was one of the first things psychologists tried to put it on, was the idea of, oh, what was his relationship with his mother like?
Yeah. Well, I love all that stuff too. All that like early FBI profiling and stuff. It's so ridiculous. I mean, they're like, the killer is someone who has an unhealthy relationship to women. You think? Like, he views himself as powerless, and the way he gets power is by killing women. I can only think of 2 people in America that applies to. Let's go arrest them. Like that early profiling, it was so hyped up, and it's so ridiculous when you read it. It's like bizarre.
Yeah. He must have been rejected by a brunette woman. That's why he kills brunettes. Yeah.
Exactly. I was just going to say, one of the things that's interesting is when you look back at the profiler, who's such a huge part of serial killer fiction now, and the movies, is the historical analog to the profiler, someone who comes into a town and they look at signs and symbols of something that's happened, some crime. And from that crime, they reconstruct the identity of a hidden killer who has been plaguing this community. That's a witch hunter. That's Cotton. That's a dude who rides into a town and says, these women are witches. Let's hang them by the neck until they're dead. Here's the magic evidence only I had the skill to unearth. So like, I love that profiler stuff because it's so toxic and it's so heroic here, eulogized, is this amazing thing.
I had never made the connection to Cotton Mather before, and I think now I will never be able to unsee that.
Profiler.
Or Matthew Hopkins in England. He was the guy who just traveled around and got paid. He's like, these 10 women are witches. Give me my money. And then moved to another town and did the same thing. Yeah.
CSI Salem.
Oh. Okay. Well, on that note, I think that's a good place. Thank you so much, Grady.
Oh, dude, it is so much fun to talk to y'all. It's always a blast. Thank y'all.
Okay. I've been looking forward to this. Well, on behalf of myself, Matt, and Mel, I'd like to thank Grady Hendrix for that wonderful, wonderful deep dive into the Final Girl. As always, I enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow Grady's work, he is on social media. His Twitter is @Grady_Hendrix. He also has a website, www.gradyhendrix.com. I think if you go to his website, you can find a newsletter sign up. I highly recommend it because it is always fun and informative. And if you want to follow us, we're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. And we also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to exclusive content, or simply rate and review us, which is entirely free for you and helps other listeners find us. The music by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.